concept exploration strategies in architecture. So we're going to take a look at how in Mudbox you can quickly build up an idea to be able to visualize that. And a couple of the things that we're going to work with here, this follows in pages 2 to 8 on the handout if you have it. Again, there it is. I always worked with layers. And we're going to work with some freeze sculpting, the ability to actually just freeze off areas and sculpt the areas around them that are allowed to be sculpted. The freeze area will prevent you from deforming geometry in whatever area you freeze. And then, of course, the ability to use shadows from the lighting and viewport filters, like ambient occlusion, cavity maps, of course, specularity, anything to help you check your forms while you're sculpting, different materials as well. And then a little tip that we'll get into there, whenever you're working with this freezing from texture, you use the white values from there. It will grab whatever white value it can, but we have some powerful color adjustment tools within Mudbox that will let you dial in those white values or get rid of the black values per se as well. And then, of course, pose tools as deformers. So I'm going to jump into a practical example here within Mudbox. And this here is actually a gas station structure that was built, I believe it was designed in AutoCAD and then used for some visualization in Max. So in helping with that workflow, we can bring that structure over, that engineering, that existing architecture over. So all these little gas pumps, this little interesting glass kind of ornate building back here. And then we can start to explore different shapes or different concepts on top of that roof. So in this example here, we just have this simple little undulated piece of geometry. And let's take a look at how we can work with that here. So, oops. I'm actually going to step right down to the base level, and we can just look at the progression of that on there. So in Mudbox, the typical way that you would work with any kind of geometry, whether you use the default meshes within Mudbox or anything you've grabbed from the Mudbox community or something you've built custom outside of Mudbox in Max, for example, you begin to subdivide. The key with working within Mudbox is start low. Always work with your lower resolution mesh so that you can start to shape or form the overall piece of geometry. So let's do that. If I right-click with my stylus here or mouse, it's definitely preferential to use a stylus, being pressure sensitive with your tablet. I'm just going to isolate this piece of geometry here. Now I'm displaying the wireframe. I'm using the W hotkey, or I can stroke in the viewport and hit wireframe there as well. The wireframe, just to note, I'd prefer to have my wireframe a bright color so that I can see it while I work. There are two wireframe colors. There's one for the tight subdivided detail and one for your base wireframe color. I always set the base wireframe color to a nice bright level so I can come back and forth while I'm working there. So with this mesh here, let's just drop down a layer. What we can start to do with this is just start to explore some overall shapes here within Mudbox. And then once we start to get an overall form, we can check these forms and see how they actually work with our existing structure. So I'm just using the grab brush for this. I'm just using a low fall off. The fall off tab is always important to have open for things like grab or even the pinch tool as well. We'll just tone that strength down. If I use my M hotkey, I'll get this little line in the middle here. Are you guys able to see that okay actually on that screen? It's pretty dark. Let's do a little tone mapper here to the rescue. Is that a little bit better? Okay, so back to this. So with the grab brush here, I can just start to grab these forms and begin to deform them out. Increasing the strength will give you a much bolder kind of effect on the overall piece of geometry. I have a different material on here that I was using just to preview that. I'm just going to grab a default material and throw it on here. It's a problem with that screen, though. With the tone mapper, it's going to blow that out, unless maybe if I turn that one. Let's actually take a look here. See if I just change the lights up, makes it a little, maybe make it a little nicer for you guys on the. Okay, that's a little bit better. All right, so using the grab brush, there's a couple different interesting things that you can do with the grab brush here with the fall off on there. You can see we get these nice soft, kind of bendy deformation effects here as we go. There's also another interesting way to work with the grab brush. It works as this tool to be able to pull and quickly shape things. But if you click in the viewport outside of your geometry and hold it down and push it in, it actually works like a kind of a force from the outside pushing it, kind of deforming your geometry in that way. And if we jump into, I'm going to jump into the side view. Oops. Let's just select this. Not sure why my side view isn't allowing me to see it right now. So front view will do. So if we grab the grab brush here, there's a new little feature that we've added in here. We've always had the ability to use mirrors, but mirroring will give you a nice, you can get some nice symmetry as you're modeling or sculpting. But the grab silhouette will actually go right through the model and give you uniform deformation right across both sides of the model here. So if we wanted to do something interesting here, like be able to grab this structure and be able to pull it up, then if we switch into the perspective view, you'll see that that's actually uniformly carrying right through the geometry there. I'm just going to deselect that. And I'm going to step up my subdivision level here. I should point out with the subdivision, when you bring in a different a mesh from the outside, from Max, for example, or Maya, the default is to have smooth positions on for subdivision. If you turn off smooth positions, you actually preserve a little bit of those hard edges. But you can take this further now. If in Max or Maya or Soft, you actually define your hard edges or creasing for subdivision, Mudbox will recognize that, which is very powerful. It'll allow you to begin to do some nice hard surface modeling there. So let's jump into actually another layer here. And we'll just look at the ability to quickly sculpt up some of those little undulating waves that we were looking at. So the sculpt tool here, if I just grab maybe a kind of a more bold fall off, and we can start to use some stamps, but let's just see what we got here. So if we just started to work with, I should grab the, we'll turn on steady stroke, which will give me a nice smooth kind of sculpting here. So if we work with that, that's much too powerful. I'll turn that down. I think I have my stamp spacing here, yeah. So I'm just turning the stamp spacing down so I get more of a kind of a smooth kind of fall off there. And using the steady stroke feature here will allow me to get these nice smooth kind of curves as I sculpt. And of course, with changing the fall off, we're going to get a very different effect on the overall brush there. And then what I'm going to do here, so that's just using a sharp kind of pointed fall off. One of the powerful things with the tools in Mudbox is any of them can be customized. And that's what the stamps are for. So for sculpting, for example, here, we can use any of these stamps and begin to deform the surface there. I'm going to use some of these new stamps that we've added into Mudbox here that'll let me kind of get some interesting little features on here. So I'm going to take off my, leave that on. I'm just going to put the stamp spacing down to 6. And we'll turn the strength right up here. So you see as I'm working here with that little nib or that stamp on the edge of my sculpt brush, I can start to get some nice different little effects in here. You can grab, I think we have a nice fold. This is a pinch, actually, which will give you a nice sharp fall off. And we can start to play with all these different kind of stamps or different things here to kind of get these overall kind of stacked undulated waves that we're working with in there. I'm just going to move on and turn this one on in here. And all of this is here is using some of these stamps here to get that kind of broken up surface and this kind of nice sharp fall off here. And the sharp fall off is achieved by using vector displacement stamps, which we'll get into later, give very precise, accurate results, but also the pinch tool here. If I turn the pinch tool on, I can, let's grab an edge and I'm just going to smooth this out a bit here, round it out. And if we work with the pinch tool, and we'll keep the fall off there, we can get right into these areas here. Whoops. And just start to sharpen up those overall details, those effects on there. And then if I use tools like the flatten tool to get underneath these areas here and just kind of flatten them out. If I hold down the shift key on any of my tools here, I'm accessing smooth. So we can do that. And we can start to kind of build up this surface here, and then start to check our forms with our underlying structure that we have there. So if we turn on, we'll just add the other, the gas station kind of bones or underlying structure in there. I'm just unhiding the geometry. There we go. And as we work here, you can see I have some light shadowing going on my surface. Let me just change. So we can change that material maybe into something that's a little more interesting. And then if we start turning on things like our ambient occlusion, you'll see that we really start to be able to see those overall kind of undulating forms as we work. Cavity is for really tight kind of, really tight details. If you have a really finite detail on something like a wrinkle, you'll be able to see that. And then what I'm going to do here, I'm going to jump into, so vector displacement here. I touched on this quickly here with using some vector displacement stamps. Now we're going to look at the ability to use some data to do some kind of ornate detailing. And this can be used for things like a render workflow. So for example, for people doing visualization using Max, you'll be able to take some of this geometry and sculpt up some detail, and then actually extract that detail and render that using vector displacement in Max out of Mental Ray, for example. So let's take a look at doing some of that here. I'm actually just going to get rid of that. There we go. So I'll just bring this up a couple subdivision levels. I'm dropping down a new sculpt layer on there. And then I'm just going to jump into my side view. And we'll put some of this kind of ornate detailing right along here. Actually, before we do that, let's take a look at the actual image. So if I jump into my image browser here in Mudbox, this allows me to take a look at all my library of stencils and textures. So for whatever project you're working on, you can build up specific libraries in here and then bookmark them, of course, to be able to access different folders. Vector displacement maps are maps that can store very complex data, very different than traditional vector displacement maps. All I'm doing here in the image browser supports full exposure on images, so high dynamic range images. So you can use this to preview HDR images for your HDR lighting setup. 32-bit floating point is what vector displacement is, so it stores the data in a very weird, kind of colored, hued way. And I'm just going to drive that in as a stencil so we can see what this is. And a way that we can apply that, I can use a couple of ways that we can do that. I'm just going to keep, whenever you're working with vector displacement, you want to keep your strength up to 100. And I'll just turn that one off. And I'll just hit flood on that right there. So that's just pushing all of that detail directly into the geometry. And I'm getting it right across on the other side. I can mirror these effects right over. And now let's look at using this in a tileable way. So the way that this is created, we're going to work with creating tileable geometry stencils, basically, with vector displacement. We're going to take this image browser here, and I'm going to freeze out a couple of areas here so I can sculpt in some detail. Let me go into this curve folder here. This will do. I'm just going to use this my freeze brush here. So if I wanted to freeze this area out here, I can kind of mask that and just kind of block this area right out here. We also have some different ways of selecting parts of the geometry in the freeze tool as well. You could use a rectangular selection marquee. And then what I can do, once I've painted that region there, I can just invert it. I'm just going to hit Shift-I so that I'm actually getting the inverse of, there we go. So everything else on the cube that I'm working with here, the surface I'm working with here is frozen, and then I want to just be able to limit my detail to this area here. So if we go back to our vector displacement map, this little ornate kind of molding, and then when I bring a stencil in, you'll see that you get all the properties over here. I'm going to turn tiling on. So Mudbox will allow you to store all of this detail, this kind of geometric detail, in an image format, which is really nice. As well, it will also let you create tileable geometry sculpting maps, which we'll take a look at here in a moment. And that's what I'm using here. So we'll use this brush here. I'm just going to get a nice fall off on there. And we can just dial that in by scraping right across the surface. I could also flood it into that area. And then if we jump into our perspective view here, you can see that we've tiled that vector displacement detailing. So what is vector displacement giving me here? Well, if you'll notice, we're getting these overhangs and undercuts on the geometry. We'll just turn this on here, get some light. So we're getting these little undercuts and overhangs here. We're getting these little cuts underneath, these little spots, these little areas that are giving me little kind of undulated surfaces or pieces of geometry that a regular displacement map wouldn't be able to store. So in effect, you can store geometry in this image-based format. And so let's just jump out and take a look at how we can build that. And this is kind of interesting in Mudbox to be able to build ornate detail and store it for a project here. I'm just going to close that and go to my Create menu and create a tiling plane. And this preview window lets me preview or define how I want to create that tiling plane. So we'll just do a 3x3 repeating tile map. And I'm going to create a target for extraction in here as well. So we'll create that tiling plane. And what we have here right now is just a simple plane that's going to let me sculpt geometry, but it's going to do something really interesting with it here. If I start to subdivide that up and begin to work with some layers, we'll just take some of our simple sculpting tools here. And we're now working with the ability to preview or work with tileable detail while you sculpt. So if I get into detail like this, it's actually going to repeat that across the surface there. So let's build something here that's kind of interesting, maybe with the sculpt tool, and we can use some of the different stamps in here. Oops. Turn that build up down. You can see with this using vector displacement to actually sculpt detail, I'm getting these different little undercuts here. So you see I'm actually cutting down underneath those tubes as I sculpt it. And it's creating this, giving me a nice preview of how that geometry is going to be tiled so that I can figure out how I want to use it there and how it's going to, how the whole structure is going to tile. I can do some interesting things like stacking over detail. And we'll turn that steady stroke on again. And then if we wanted to use this actual detail here, you can see that we're previewing how it's going to tile across the surface here with this geometry kind of stacked up and kind of squeezed. We can actually extract this very quickly here. So we'll actually extract this map. And in here, map extraction underneath the map menu, I'm going to use extract vector displacement. So we'll add all in there. I'm going to just need the extraction plane, target for my target model, and then the tiling plane as my source model in there. I'm just going to use a 1K map. We'll just give it a name here. Folds. And it's going to ask me if I want to put underscore VDM on the file name. Vector displacement in Mudbox is its own format, so it needs that to recognize. And it'll use a 32-bit format. 32-bit formats like TIFF, EXR, HDR, you can render out your vector displacement with. So I'm going to use relative tangent, which is the default space, and that's what you want to use for sculpting things. For rendering into Max or Maya, you would use things like absolute tangent. And if you have something that's deforming, that's where you'd want to use a different tangent space in here. But for sculpting, we're going to stick with relative tangent in here. So I'm just hitting extract. You can see how fast it is here. It's just extracting there. It's finished. And if we go to our folder, I just put it in the default directory here. So choose that folder there. And there's our little vector displacement map in there. We'll just adjust the... You can see that it stores in this very weird kind of hues of color. The green is kind of things that are sticking above the surface. Red, hues of red will be undercuts. So now we can take this geometry here, and if we dial this over here as a stencil, and let's actually hide away this guy. We'll just create a new plane again. And then with that stencil, I'm actually going to set the tiling on it. So we can use this to store these details and quickly create stamps or stencils that work in a very nice tileable fashion here as well. So let's turn that one off. So you can see I'm repeating that detail. It's giving me exactly what we've just created. That's the interesting thing about vector displacement. It stores completely accurately the geometry that you've created there. And if we wanted to use this in some sort of ornate sense, this kind of structure to go across the top of an installation or something along those lines, we could put this as just one area of tiling right across the top with something on there. Oops. So while we're on that here's an interesting case study that Mark Foster Gage of Gage Clemenceau Architects in New York partnered up with Yale. He actually is a professor at the Yale School of Architecture as well. And they used Mudbox to explore different disheveled geometries, is what they called it. Surfaces that they could build these panels with, these actual scale model panels, within Mudbox. So they sculpted up all of these different details. Some are very organic, some are very crystalline and sharp and hard-edged. And then what they did is they actually milled them out in life-size scaled structures, and they could use them in things like installations. So the idea was the exploration of kind of this free-form idea to be able to sculpt out different patterns or things rather quickly. Things that would be, a little more difficult or more time-consuming in a traditional poly modeling package like Max or Maya, for example. So here's some of the results here of some of the student work, the actual scale installations here, printed in a variety of different materials. And this was right out of Mudbox into a milling machine where they were able to mill out these structures and put them on display and use them for different exhibits. And then Neoscape here, for their architectural visualization, using Mudbox in a really kind of interesting way for furniture design, for furniture visualization. So you can see that they're actually building this little ottoman here, and then they're using it in their visualization, which I believe was rendered out in Max over here.